Okay, welcome everybody to the November webinar hosted by SIG93 Research on Teaching and Learning in Physical Education, which is a special interest group for AERA. And we are really excited to welcome Dr. Wilson and Dr. Haegele to talk about adapted physical education. And I think this is a really important topic because we often see adapted PE as almost siloed as its own separate entity. And, to be honest, I don't even know that many scholars in adapted PE. And so one of the goals of this webinar was to help us all try to bridge that gap between the two spheres and to recognize that like adapted PE is the Venn diagram is just a circle, and to expand our connections across the different spheres and to expand our understanding of what adapted PE means and looks like within the context of broader physical education research. So very excited to welcome Wes from Illinois, right? Urbana-Champaign, and Justin from Old Dominion. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you two.
Oh, thanks, Samara. We are really grateful to be here. Mara reached out to us maybe like 2 or 3 months ago asking if we would do this webinar. And, I like to do things for people in the field that I want to be around, that I want to work with. And so like, oh yeah, sure, sure. And then maybe, last week or 2 weeks ago, Justin brings up like, hey, we got to think about what we're going to say. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, let's do that. But, we are excited to be here, and we think it's meaningful for us to, uh, let you all know what we're working on, things that are going on in our field, which is very much the PE field. And so with that, I guess this is our presentation on disabled students, enlightened ableism, and adaptive physical education. Just as an advanced organizer, we're going to briefly talk about who we are just because we're not presumptuous enough to think that everyone here knows who we are. We're going to briefly touch on some of the political context that surrounds special education and APE more specifically. We're going to then transition to talking about the importance of elevating student voice, what that looks like. And within that context, we'll talk about enlightened ableism a little bit. We'll use uh, the notion of inclusion and looking at intersubjective experiences of disabled students as one of the examples of that. And then we will pivot to the last 20 years of what research has said from the perspective of disabled students. We'll sort of finish the presentation part of the afternoon by talking about a recent attempt that Justin and I had at trying to elevate student voice. It's going to be like a shameless plug of something that we've done fairly recently. And then we'll be happy to open it up for questions, or if you just want to tell us that we did a great job, that would be fine as well. All right. So who we are, I will start. I am an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. This is the start of my third year here, but the eighth overall since graduation. I identify as an APE researcher. I concern myself a lot with the socio-relational space in which both teachers and disabled students occupy and what their lived experiences are within those spaces. I also see being a teacher educator as a really big part of what I do, training both undergrad and graduate uh, individuals who are going to go on to be practitioners. Um, I'm also a co-director of the Pedagogical Kinesiology Laboratory here at the University of Illinois, which again is a way that we train both undergrad and graduate students in the art of research. And then I'll end this little introduction by noting that I'm a grantee holder. I'm a grant holder of several U.S. Department of Education training grants, one of which, Project Caper, is inter-university doctoral training grant that I work alongside with Dr. Justin Haegele at ODU, as well as Nicole Kirk from University of Georgia, and we will be referencing Project Caper a little bit towards the end of our presentation. But with that, I'll turn it over to Justin to let him tell you what he's all about.
Hey everybody, my name is Justin Haegele. I am the Colgate Darden Endowed Professor here at Old Dominion University. I also work in adapted PE. I don't really identify as an adapted PE researcher. I think physical education for disabled people is probably where I would situate myself, and there's reasons for that discrepancy I'm happy to share. Here at ODU, I have two different roles. I direct the Center for Movement, Health, and Disability, which is a research and training center where we conduct a good amount of research in adapted physical activity, and we also train large, for us, cohorts of doctoral students and student scholars in the area. We also host a variety of different service learning programs and so on and so forth. I also direct the Darden College of Education and Professional Studies Research Support Center, which is a relatively new role for me, but I'm now working with faculty across the College of Education in supporting them in grant acquisition and manuscript writing. And so being productive in adapted physical activity has now added to my responsibilities to be productive in other areas of the College of Education. I also hold U.S. Department of Ed grants, grants in a variety of different places. We have annual spending with our center just over $1 million in grant funding over the last few years. So that's a big part of what we're doing. And a lot of that is within the physical education sphere. So yeah, beyond that, I'm gonna let Wes go ahead and do his thing for a while, and then I'll pop back on here in a little bit.
Thanks, Justin. All right, so I don't want to belabor this, but I feel like we do need to talk a little bit about this because this is, um, you know, fundamentally can shift how we see physical education for disabled students in the US. And so I don't think anyone would be surprised by these statements, but we do know that public education is becoming increasingly a politicized area of concern. I- for our purposes, we have seen a lot of uncertainty around grants, especially personnel training grants, where we train special educators, adaptive PE teachers, related service professionals to meet the job demands of open positions in the US. And so over the last multiple decades, these have been really important sources of workforce preparation. And there was and there still is uncertainty around, will those grants continue? How might they change to align with the quote priorities of the new administration, unquote. So we've already had grant competitions canceled. We've had changes to what those grant competitions look like. And so, if you ask some of my colleagues in the field, this meme sort of embodies what a lot of people are feeling. Whereas we feel like we're engulfed in flames, but we're like, okay, this is fine, we will persist. Um, and those of you that don't know me very well, I use sarcasm and humor as my coping mechanisms. And so this, I think, kind of speaks to the internal struggle that I kind of was living through, the last, you know, 10 or so months, right? But we have learned a little bit about these priorities. There's still a lot of uncertainty, though. We do know from some of the U.S. Department of meetings that we have attended to earlier this year that they want to, the priorities of this incoming or of this current administration is to redistribute education decision-making power from federal levels to state levels and an emphasis on school choice, which obviously we can't unpack, but that does have huge implications, especially from members of marginalized communities. More specific to special education, again, unclear future surrounding things like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act idea of 2004. It has been an awful long time since that law was looked at for reauthorization, so that's pretty uncommon. Right now, I don't know one person in our field that's like, hey, let's look at that right now. And so it's unclear whether IDEA is going to remain in the Department of Education where it's been housed. Uh, there's been talks of it moving to HHS or other departments. And just today, I saw something on the news to say that the Trump administration is looking to reorganize some existing parts, in part in the Office of Special Education Programs, where a lot of our grants or our grants are through. And so we don't know exactly what that means either. And I'll finally end by saying there's been problematic statements by a lot of political appointees in the U.S. Department of Education as well as HHS. And I will not go into that in any more detail, but if you'd like, uh, you can Google it. But there is problematic things being said in leadership that's not reflective of sort of the direction that many of us are heading in the field. And so this provides just sort of a really brief uh, intro to sort of what we are dealing with, more specifically in APE and special education. But of course, this also has huge implications for education in general. All right, and so with this context in place, what can we do as educational scholars? And I should preempt this by saying that these are just our opinions, mainly my opinions. Justin signed off on this part of the PowerPoint, but these are again a lot of personal reflections and reflections that I think that Justin and I have had over the last few years. We talk a lot, and so we are working through these different ideas such as enlightened ableism and how we can best elevate the voices of disabled students, disabled people. And so, something that I find centering for me is this quote that we can combine academia with activism to see them as two roles that, rather than being juxtaposed, are complementary with each other. And so, as I kind of develop as a scholar and a teacher educator, I think this is quite true for me to see them not as sort of these separate ideas, but that through what I do as a teacher educator, as a scholar, um, a service provider, that there needs to be that mission to elevate the voices and experiences of disabled folk as part of that overall of the overall mission of what I hope to accomplish professionally in my career as well as any labs or universities programs that I'm a part of. And so, how do we elevate the voices of disabled students? Um, this has been something that again, over the last maybe 5 or 6 years, I've really been thinking about. And I will say that Justin has been a big part of sort of my overall thinking about this as we've gotten into, soliciting opinions and experiences directly from disabled kids and adults, because we don't have those lived experiences. You have to go to them to understand how they make meaning of those experiences, right? And so this is still sort of an iterative process, and I'm still learning about these things. And I'm still finding, oh, that's sort of an ableist thing to write, or that's an ableist thing to think about. Um, and so, sort of with that preface, I think sort of this global goal of dismantling an ableist educational system is what we should strive for. Now, that is a huge, huge task, right? And so there's so many different injustices that are done in educational spheres, right? That can seem like, well, yeah, that's totally what we need to do, but how do we do that? And so, for the purposes of, I think, this conversation today, I wanted to focus more inward, things that I feel like I can control a little bit more. And so, beginning with my own reflexivity, how I identify myself in this PE for disabled kiddos space, and what that means for me, and how my experiences how that affects the way that I see the experiences of others and how I can make sure that, the non-disability power that I hold does not further marginalize these groups, right? And so I think with that, enlightened ableism is one of these really interesting concepts that, again, is something that I've been learning about over the last couple of years, more recently, right? That I think is a good place to start. And so I really like this description of enlightened ableism. It's when you explicitly non-ableist beliefs are juxtaposed to the condoning of ableism in practice. And so, I like to think that I try really hard to be anti-ableist, but I realize that sometimes I don't always meet those highest standards. And so here's some practical examples that I've been thinking about recently and through my discussions that I've had with Justin about things that might be enlightened ableism, where we preach that we're trying to do all this really good stuff for disabled students, but then sort of the practices of things that we do might betray those ideals. And so things like using disability simulations, these have been pretty standard practice in teacher education programs. Like, okay, we're going to be learning about visually impaired students, so let's throw on some blindfolds. Let's have them try to move around the gym. Let's have them move around the building, have them do all these types of activities just so they understand how hard it is to be blind. And this is something that's pretty common. I myself have done it, especially in my earlier years. Then I participated in a study that I actually Justin led, where we, challenged, we ended up feeling challenged on sort of those held beliefs that that was a really useful pedagogical practice. But then upon reflection, it's like, well, you're taking on this mantle of a disability that you have no embodied knowledge of, right? And so that is really problematic because you can all of a sudden be like, oh, I'm not visually impaired anymore. And so that's something that those with lived experiences can't do, right? And that can be, I found dehumanizing in some instances. So that's one type of practice that I think that I've been looking at a lot more. And I don't do those types of simulations anymore the as part of the teacher education coursework that I offer. Something that's more recent is writing vignettes from the perspective of disabled students. This is also fairly common, especially if you think about textbook chapters, practitioner articles in JOPERD, and Palestra, which is sort of our APE version of the JOPERD journal, right? We often write these vignettes. Sometimes they're from the perspective of the teachers, but sometimes we write from the perspective of someone who identifies as disabled, right? And that's really hard to do as a researcher because you do not know what it's like. You might be informed by, your experiences interacting with a disabled person, but it's problematic because you do not have that embodied knowledge. You can't speak with authority because that's not part of your lived experiences. And so that is something that I have also done over the past, where I've written these types of vignettes from the perspective of a disabled student, right? And honestly, one of the most recent ones that came out was something that I worked on with Mara, where I wrote a couple of vignettes from the perspective of a disabled teacher, and I wrote a vignette from the perspective of a disabled student. And so when I was putting this together, I actually reflected upon it, like, wow, that's problematic, right? And so that's something that I'm still thinking about as sort of these taken for granted educational practices that a lot of times we just don't think about, which could be potentially enlightened ableism, right? Because it kind of goes against the very message we preach. And so I'm still struggling with that a little bit. And this last point is this notion of inclusion and what inclusion means. A lot of folks see inclusion as a space where both disabled and non-disabled students are educated alongside each other. And we'll get into this a little bit more later, but this is really problematic to see inclusion in that way because that pretty much necessitates any sort of inclusive environment requiring the presence of non-disabled students or non-disabled people, right? And so then if you work forward in logic a little bit, would that mean the only value a disabled student could have in an inclusive space is to the extent to which they could be in the same space as a non-disabled student, right? And that's something that's sort of mental gymnastics that I'm still working through, right? Like, well, is that right that someone can only feel like they're included if they have non-disabled people present? Or is it possible to feel included in physical education spaces where there aren't any non-disabled students, right? And so, again, I think that's another thing that I see myself in my personal growth as a scholar trying to confront and be like, well, is that an ableist belief where we have to be in the presence of non-disabled people to have value, right? And so these are some of my musings, and I know I've talked at length with Justin over the last couple of months and years about these types of things, but they do inform my practice. They inform the discussions that I try to have with pre-service professionals as well as other scholars that I work alongside. All right, and so sort of back to this slide. How do we elevate the voices of disabled students? So again, these are not my own words. These are words that I have collected from my conversations with Justin and with other folks in our field over the years, but kind of shirking this idea of being experts of other people's experiences, right? We don't have that embodied knowledge of disability, what the students that we work with, what their lives are like, right? We can be academic allies and advocates, but again, we can't really speak on their behalf, although that is what we've done a lot of. in the years since we started uh, conducting research in physical education and the experiences of disabled students. And so instead of uh, calling ourselves experts, rather pivoting the focus away from what we think their experiences should be to asking them simply like, what do you feel like you're included in this space? Focusing the meaning making on their own interpretations and what that means, excavated from their perspective rather than what we feel that they should feel like in different PE settings. And this is kind of setting us up for a discussion on inclusion and problematizing not having that intersubjective experience being taken account of. So I've talked too much. Justin, you're up, buddy.
Sure, sure. So this is something that I've written quite a bit about at this stage in my career, and I think about and present on often. So I'm happy to go ahead and do that again here. And I'm going to talk to you guys about inclusion and what inclusion means. I don't know if do I have control of this? Or you have control of this, Wes? Yeah, Wes, you're muted. I can't hear anything you're saying, dude.
So embarrassing. Do you want me to just do the entire slide for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to talk through the slide, but you're welcome to move them if you
There
can.
you go. Yep.
But anyway, so, I've been thinking about inclusion for a long time at this point. I've probably made more enemies than friends talking about my beliefs about inclusion. But so inclusion is this word, right? That's everywhere, right? It's a form of edu speak at this stage. It basically means nothing and it means everything at the same time. We love putting it into things and put it into a mission statement. Your college probably has it in a mission statement. We talk about inclusion in PE, but we don't define what inclusion means. We kind of have these presupposed assumptions about what inclusion could mean. And one of those assumptions is inclusion as this disconnected and disembodied individual's presence within a space and a proximity to their peers, like what Wes was talking about. But what we typically use inclusion for as this disconnected space, it ignores what people think about being within that space. And so the position that most adapted PE scholars still take today is that inclusion is a space where people with and without disabilities or disabled and non-disabled people exist. When I think about inclusion, or when I think about that space, I use the phrase integrated for that space, because I want to separate conceptually the idea of inclusion and a space or a place that people exist within. So Wes, could we go to the next one? So here's a few issues that we've listed in the past when it comes to inclusion being a physical space. If you think of inclusion only as a physical space, then you are successful the second that kids or that disabled and non-disabled kids are in the same space. Meaning, no matter what happens within that space, it's inclusive. And so if inclusion is inherently a good thing, then once disabled and non-disabled kids are in the same space, it's a good thing. They can be punching each other in the face, but it's inclusive, so it's good. It also suggests that disabled students should fit in, right? Teachers don't need to be challenged to make spaces, curriculum, activities, physical education generally positive if inclusion is just listed as a physical space. You've got the space, you've got the school, you're great. You also suggest that students with disabilities need to fit in. It doesn't really matter what the individual's needs, preferences, or wants are. They have to fit into the space that's dubbed inclusion. It also creates a hierarchy where integrated spaces or what people call inclusive spaces are favored over other spaces, which I think is unfair because regardless of the space in which students are being educated in, they should be respected and they can each have positive educational outcomes. I'm highly biased with this. My teaching in New York City Department of Ed before coming into higher ed was within a separated space, a school just for autistic kids. And the type of education that we provided within that space was what I would call inclusive, meaning kids felt a sense of belonging, a sense of value, and accepted by their peers. Lastly, this space, this void of understanding of what inclusion is, doesn't really matter how kids feel within that space. We put kids in the space, we call it inclusive, rubber stamp, don't care anymore. I'm moving a little fast. This feels a little aggressive for me. But I just did a presentation over at my College of Ed where I mentioned how unproductive people are. So I've got some good energy going right now. So Wes, can you click it again? So Wes and I have spent some time thinking about some problems with this concept of inclusion, especially the disembodied and disconnected definitions of inclusion. If you're interested in the movie 10 Things I Hate About You, which was from the mid 90s, my wife has made me watch this probably 1,000 times at this point. Wes and I have written a poem about things that we hate about inclusion, including, the vague meaning or the material meaning, as well as like inclusive images, the idea of inclusive strategies, which are essentially just teaching strategies that people put the word inclusion on to gain social or material capital. I think personally that inclusion is more about teachers. It's more about making teachers feel good about themselves than it is about the students, because how often do we really think about disabled students? But I think at the end of the day, the thing is we don't hate inclusion. I don't hate the idea of inclusion. I just hate the way that it's used and bastardized by PE and adapted PE people. So if you're interested in this, there's a chapter in Donna's and Maureen's book that's in the bottom right-hand corner. You can go check it out. Wes, let's go to the next one, man. I like the energy today. We're really moving. So for me, the writing that I do, inclusion is more than an individual's quantifiable existence within a space or a lesson or a context. So what we try to do in our writing is we extend beyond materiality and the physical existence of a person within a space, and rather we focus on an individual's intersubjective experience within that space. And so in that way, it doesn't really matter what teachers say or what scholars say. It doesn't matter if Wes says a space is inclusive, because that's not really possible. It's the feeling and the experience, the intersubjective experience that's inclusive. And so for us to know if an intersubjective experience is inclusive, if somebody feels included, we have to talk to disabled students. And I don't I don't do the whole we need to talk to all students thing, because I think that when we start saying all students, it's similar to the reaction to Black Lives Matter saying all lives matter, and that once we start saying all students, we re-marginalize disabled students, because it's not possible to focus on all students at the same time. And so me, this is one of the tropes that guides a lot of the work that I do, which is that we must start we must place feelings of being included above feeling like we're including. I do not care if faculty think they're creating inclusive environments. I don't care. I care, do disabled students feel included within environments? And so I've gone down quite a path scholarship wise with this. This is the paper that's on the screen now is the first time that we attempted to conceptually separate inclusion as an intersubjective or subjective experience from the place. So we reintroduced the idea of integration as the physical space or the placement. This is a term that was used in the 1980s. We tried to reintroduce it into the literature so that we can conceptually separate inclusion as a feeling. And this was one of the Young Scholar Awards at NACAHE back in 2019. And then since then, we've further developed this. I partnered with a scholar from Leeds Beckett University in the UK named Anthony Marr. We've worked extensively on this type of work. This is a paper in one of the AERA journals where we further conceptualize inclusion as an intersubjective experience, which recognizes both the individual nature of the experience as well as the shared nature between students. And then we finally define some of these tenets: belonging, being feelings of being connected to and cared for by others, acceptances, and individuals' perception of how others involve them within the community. And conceptualizing valued was actually more difficult than the other two because it's not well defined within education contexts. And so we went into the workforce development literature and we talked about it being the confirmation of a person's possession of qualities of worth and desirability. So all these are interconnected in nature because it takes more than just the person in order for them to feel included. Wes, let's keep going. Hit it again, Wes. So once we conceptualize inclusion in this way, it requires us to shift power within research and scholarship and pedagogy, where instead of it being the teacher that's talking about things being inclusive, it is the student's voice that must be acknowledged as the force for constructing experiences as being inclusive. We don't care what the stakeholders think. I love saying it so directly. Isn't that fun? So it's a very important distinction. It recognizes that while disabled and non-disabled people might be in the same space, they may experience those spaces very differently, right? We might have non-disabled people in that space having a great time. We might have disabled people in that space having not so great of a time. That's essentially what research shows, which I think Wes will talk about later. It no longer allows us to reduce inclusion to an inspection criteria or pedagogical practices or settings. So like no matter how many ticks you check on a box, you cannot, in my opinion, say that a space is inclusive without talking to the students within the space. And this is my favorite part. It permits scholars to problematize integrated spaces, allowing us to understand if the things happening within these spaces elicit feelings of inclusion. And I've spent probably 7 years now, consistently doing studies in this area. I want to say we've talked to over 200 disabled people about their experiences within integrated settings and self-contained settings. And we're going to talk about every single study one by one for the next 4 hours. Or not, Wes, let's keep going. So inclusion as an intersubjective experience also allows it to take on this fluid nature, which is really important, that we recognize that like students can feel included one moment or 1 minute or one half an hour or one class or 1 week, and then the next moment, week, period, they might not feel included. So this is dynamic, right? It's spatially dynamic. You could leave one space and enter another space, and perhaps there's things within that space that no longer make you or allow you to feel accepted, sense of belonging, a sense of value. It's also temporal, where things change over time. Your feelings ebb and flow throughout the period of a class. You could feel included 1 minute, and then another student comes by and punches you in the side of the head, which we hope doesn't happen, but it could happen. And then you no longer have those positive feelings about your experience, right? And so we need to recognize that feelings change within classes. It's not the class that exists for us to say that those feelings are guaranteed. So as we keep going, Anthony, hold on, go back one, Wes. You're going too fast now. As we think about inclusion, Anthony and I were challenged to think about the concept of exclusion and whether, if we're going to say that inclusion is not a space, should exclusion be a space? And so we again, wrote a paper together about exclusion and conceptualized that as well as an and intrasubjective experience of psycho-emotional disablement and ableism. And so essentially separating again a separated space from exclusion. And so go ahead, Wes, hit the next one. And so with these conceptualizations, typically what you'll see in the literature, especially before 2020, is that inclusion only happens in integrated spaces, exclusion only happens in separated spaces. But as these conceptualizations continue to churn, what we are now suggesting is that feelings of inclusion can happen in any space. It can happen in integrated spaces, separated spaces, unique educational spaces like reverse mainstreaming spaces. Just as well, feelings of exclusion like psycho-emotional disablement can happen in integrated spaces, separated spaces, other spaces. And so we need to conceptually separate the space from the feeling and then recognize that those feelings can happen in a variety of different types of spaces. And so I also have this concept that I want to talk about called inclusion porn, right? And so a lot of people have heard of inspiration porn, which was popularized by Stell Young, which is a great concept. Anthony and I were talking about inclusion again, doing the same, narrative back and forth. We got an email from a faculty member at UVA named, it just jumped out of my head. What's the faculty member at UVA's name that sent me this email? Wes, what's her name? You know her, Disability Sports.
Oh, Diane Wheely?
No,
No.
no, no, Young. Abby Fine. So Abby
Oh,
Fine
Abby
sent me this email and she said, you've talked about inclusion, we've talked about inspiration porn. How come nobody's ever talked about inclusion porn? And then what Anthony and I asked her if we could take the phrase and run with it. And so what we think about in inclusion porn, and I think this is highly related to the conversations that we're having about enlightened ableism, is that there's a lot of academics and teachers and administrators who attempt to gain social capital based on the concept of inclusion while also exploiting non-disabled or disabled students. And so they are putting disabled students into what I would refer to as harm's way in order for them to gain social capital. For example, we have full inclusion schools that don't necessarily meet the needs of kids, but rather call themselves a full inclusion school for social capital purposes. I would call that inclusion porn. Let's go, Wes. So we offered this as a conceptual tool and language for people to think about. We're not accusing people. I'm not out there saying porn, 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 porn. Rather, this is a way for us to think about a concept so that we can continue to problematize the behaviors of faculty and scholars within our field. So there's 4 features of inclusion porn. One is that it appears more concerned with the stakeholders who are attempting to promote inclusion than the disabled people who are within those spaces. It fabricates a reality that's always attainable, always pleasurable and satisfying. No one ever gets emotionally hurt. And you hear that a lot in the inclusion literature, that it's wonderful, but we don't know anything about what's happening. It's a black box or a void that students are sent within. Inclusion where disabled people are not viewed as individuals, but are rather objectified. So we're not talking about the person and their characteristics and their needs, but rather we're trying to get those disabled bodies into integrated spaces. I would refer to that as inclusion porn. And then when inclusion is performative, right? It doesn't matter what's actually happening. It doesn't matter what's happening within the class, as long as we're calling it an inclusive class. And so there's a few other examples to throw out there to you about what I think inclusion porn might be and problems that I see within the field of adapted PE or adapted physical activity or PE generally. And one is that faculty oftentimes are over-interpreting stories of disabled people to make the points that support their claims, right? So they'll hear something that a disabled person said, or they'll say, I have a friend who's disabled, and this is what they might think. I had a participant in a study once say, it's nice that you get all these quotes from blind or visually impaired people, but I know a blind person, they said the opposite. And I thought, that's great. Another example is when disabled people's knowledge is devalued and discredited in order to support non-disabled views. So, if we're having conversations at conferences and people are showing quotes from disabled people and faculty say things like, I disagree with that, I know better, I've been doing this for 20 years, or this is a good one. I had a faculty one time say, how could students be saying they're having bad experiences? I've been working in this field for 20 years and helping support students. And so to me, that is a form of testimonial injustice where we're discrediting the views of disabled people to, again, further our own value. And the last is a concept that I've been thinking about. We've done a little bit of writing on, not quite a bit yet, called disability ventriloquism, where the voices of disabled people are used by non-disabled people just to support or perpetuate their own ideas for their agenda, right? So people want specific things. They want to say that, this pedagogical practice is the best possible pedagogical practice for disabled people. So they're going to use disabled people's voices to support those things. I think that's all I've got. I think the rest of this is Wes. That was quite a bit of stuff. So yeah, Wes, take it away, man.
Thanks, Justin. So we thought it now would be nice to pivot to sort of more of what the research has said about the intersubjective experiences of disabled people, kids in multiple different physical education settings. Um, and so what I'm going to present over the next couple of slides are actually the work of Mr. Paul H. Warner, who is actually one of our scholars on the Inter-University Training Grant Project CAPER. And so I wanted to make sure that I gave him, his props for putting this together as he is writing the manuscript for this. So basically what the team did is over the last 20 years, we've looked at research over the last 20 years that comes about the experiences of the disabled students as they report it, right? And so it's about their intersubjective experiences. And so we looked at basically from 2005 to 2025 of what those reports have looked like in the scoping review. And so this was over 80 studies. And so that's a lot of studies to do a scoping review. So Paul has worked very hard over months and months to put this together. And so we just wanted to share you a couple of the emergent findings from this project because I think it really highlights the importance of looking to disabled kids and disabled adults as the meaning makers of their experiences, as the authors of those own experiences, rather than what we think their experiences should be, right? And so at the bottom of the slide, you'll see a frequency count sorts, basically based on how many studies mentioned a particular code. it was quoted as either having an experience or not, right? And so what you'll see here is things that are really consistent of what we said so far. Across these 80 plus studies, the most common code was that the disabled student was perceived differently and they got different treatment compared to other students, and this was an isolating thing for them. Number two, peer teachers didn't see disabled students as able, didn't understand the student, and that was in almost 58% of the studies. I'm not going to read all of these, but you'll see a lot. These are not positive experiences, right? Um, and so I asked Paul a couple days ago to go down to the first positive code. It took him 26 codes to get to the first positive code, talking about their experiences in physical education, which you'll see on the right hand of the screen, is that in 30% of the studies, they had participants saying, hey, I had positive relationships with either the teachers or the aides, right? And so that is really far down in the list, going from 60% being perceived differently, getting different treatment, all the way down to 30%, reflecting more the magnitude of these sort of the frequency that these things are being reported. And so I think that this is particularly striking since I know that I've gotten a lot of this feedback and pushback from reviewers, and I think Justin would as well, saying, well, oh, there's also qualitative work showing that, they have really good experiences in PE. Right. And yes, I mean, you can probably find qualitative research that explains the whole continuum of different experiences. Right. And so here we tried to more quantify like what, actually how much of the research is showing that versus problematizing these different PE settings as areas where feelings of inclusion aren't possible. A couple other slides related to the scoping review. This is just information that probably won't surprise you, but it's very West world centric. So a lot of this research being done in the U.S. Second is England, and so the global East, the global South is not represented in this work, and this is not particularly surprising, but it is noteworthy since we know that disabled kiddos exist everywhere, right? Publication by year. This is becoming a better research area, particularly in the last 10 or so years. And you can see the trends here where starting in about 2015, 16 is where we see the proliferation of this type of research. And this seems to coincide with maybe when Justin Haegele finished his degree and started doing his thing. But it is becoming a really popular area of research. And this is the last slide about this scoping review. I thought it was really interesting that 48 articles focus on contemporaneous accounts. And so that was basically asking children, adolescents, how do you experience PE or how do you experience AP or whatever the particular study was, right? And whereas 33 studies were more retrospective in nature, where we were asking adults to reflect back on their experiences as disabled students in physical education. And then finally, it won't surprise most of you probably that most of this research is done in integrated settings. It's really small, but that blue area of the pie, that is integrated PE settings, whereas other alternative placement options that at least are used in the US are much more under researched areas, right? So Justin mentioned things like self-contained or segregated settings for PE for disabled students, right? That we just don't have nearly as many studies in those areas. There's much more to be said here, but you'll just have to wait until this scoping review gets published down the way. Okay, finally, I mentioned earlier that as a shameless plug, I thought it would be appropriate, though, to talk about one of Justin and my more recent projects where we really attempted to elevate the voices of disabled children and disabled adults in putting together an edited collection of what essentially is nonfiction narratives, where we solicited contributions from authors where they would from disabled kids into disabled adults where they would contribute a chapter to this edited collection. Uh, and so we really sought to get a full range of experience. Some of our authors talk about integrated settings, some talk about segregated settings for PE services, some talk about one talked about receiving services in a at-home setting. Um, and so this was our attempt at trying to identify things like enlightened ableism. And we talk about this in some of the chapters of the book where we're really cognizant of our role in telling these types of stories. And so, the task was for us to co-construct as editors these different chapters where we tried very, very hard not to change meaning. And so if you read the chapters from the authors, chapters from the kiddos and adults who committed that submitted chapters, you'll see typos, you'll see incorrect grammar because we told the copy editor that we didn't want anything changed. Uh, and so we're trying to be really transparent with the process. And so our role as editors was really strange on this. And I've never edited a book before in my life, but I get the sense that the process that we did with this is sort of atypical, right? But we do hope that the authors that contribute chapters were allowed to tell their stories in a way that were their words and their meaning, and that we were just there to essentially bind the book and send it to the publishers. One last thing that I'll note here is that this is open access. And so you can download it from the publisher's website for free in entirety or by chapter. So please don't spend any money on this because it is available for free. And it might be useful as a sort of a case-based learning tool to give those authentic accounts from the perspective of disabled kids and disabled adults about their PE experiences. Anything, Justin, that you want to add to this slide as we shamelessly plug this thing?
Nah, this book is great.
Thanks, man. Okay. So with that, I feel like we've talked for a long time. Um, the question slide, the obligatory question slide.
Thank you, Justin and Wes. Also, Justin, I am really sorry for butchering your last name in my introduction. I don't know
You
what's
see my
wrong
last name, Mara?
with
Like,
There's a lot of
you
vowels
know,
involved.
there's a whole history with Ellis Island as to why my name looks like that, so I don't blame anybody for messing it up.
Well, I apologize. So I think it would be great to hear. It doesn't necessarily have to be questions, although if you have questions for Wes and Justin, I think they would certainly welcome them. But there's also the opportunity here for commentary, for connecting to your own work or your own experiences, your own teaching, any of that, and just to have a little bit of a conversation for the last 10 or so minutes of the webinar. So I would really love to open it up. I have some thoughts, but I'm going to try not to dominate things here. And you don't even need to like formally raise your hand. You can put something in the chat or you can just speak.
I have a question. Terrific presentation, and I love both of your work. I use it a lot in my adaptive PE class, and this idea of feeling valued, accepted, and what was the other one? There's a third one: valued, accepted, and frick,
Belonging.
belonging. That's what it is. So my question is like with teachers, you can feel like that in any space. Um, Do you have any recommendations or like how would a teacher go about like do my students feel like that and having that conversation with them?
Sean, that's the number one question I get when doing this presentation is how do teachers figure out how to, explore if people have those feelings? And I think it starts with talking to students. And I know that's like the obvious answer, but before we can expect students to give us honest and clear answers, we need to develop relationships with students in a way that they feel comfortable doing so. So I've heard some faculty say, this is great, we should teach students or children to advocate for themselves. And for me, advocacy doesn't do anything unless teachers are willing to develop those relationships and have open conversations and be reflective about what they think about what they're doing. And so to me, it's about teaching teachers how to openly communicate and be reflective and be thoughtful about what they could do moving forward as educators. kids who are in positive relationships with teachers will talk to the teacher, but without developing that relationship first, you can't expect a student to say anything open or have, honest dialogue. Even PhD students will just tell you what you want to hear if you don't have a good relationship with them.
Thank you.
Other thoughts or questions from the audience? It's just like when you ask your class a question, you get dead silence. You're like, no.
I feel like if you give a presentation and nobody has questions, it probably means that you were very good at explaining everything. So
You were
nothing is,
very thorough.
It's
yeah.
like a stunned silence.
You're just so good. I mean, I definitely like am about to download the book, so that was awesome. Thank you for that. I mean, one of the things that stood out for me was so many of the parallels between this work and the work that, I have centered my focus on, which is that of like race and racial justice in education and physical education. And so much of what you're saying is applicable to another marginalized group. And I guess I might ask you all, A, how do you see the intersection of disability with other marginalized identities as applicable in these contexts? And then B, what might you say about the tension between, um, you know, trying to do what's right, trying to create an inclusion space, and then being met with the idea of not doing it well or unintentionally marginalizing disabled groups, and how do scholars and teachers and people who want to do right but make mistakes, like how do they move through that? So two things there.
Justin, you should take the first swing at this one, and I'll chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when people want to do the right thing, whatever the right thing is, I think the first step is to figure out if what we believe the right thing to do is what the people we're trying to do those things for believe the right thing to do is. There's a lot of people in the adapted PE world, whether they're researchers or teachers, that think they're doing the right thing, right? They think the behaviors that they have are right. But a lot of them aren't talking with disabled people, don't have relationships with disabled people, don't engage with critical disability studies research or scholarship. It's similar to, critical race theory, critical gender studies. Like, I think that there's a lot of stuff that we assume as non-disabled people who sometimes have a bit of a savior complex about what we're doing and how great it is for people. I mean, it's very simple things like developing a strategy and saying, this is inclusive and we're going to tell everybody about it and let's shout it from the rooftop. And yet, like, we've never really included disabled people within that. I've never been asked, like, I want to develop this strategy for straight white dudes. And what is your opinion on this straight white dude strategy? And I think that's a lot more reasonable than like me as a straight white dude saying, I'm going to develop this strategy for blind kids, but I'm not going to talk to any blind people about it. Like, it just sounds kind of insane when you say it like that. Like, we just we just do things to people instead of doing things with and for people. I think you bring up an interesting question when you start thinking about like social justice literature in PE generally. A couple of years ago, I worked with Fabian Arroyo and Jennifer Walton Facette on a study looking at how social justice research in PETE has included disabled people, and probably unsurprisingly, it's very little. And so even within like the social justice sphere, disabled people are still marginalized by those who, are not trying to be marginalizing, right? Like, we've got our general typical PE scholars who probably marginalize disabled people on a regular basis unknowingly. But then we've also got social justice scholars who oftentimes aren't looking at disabled people as one of those identities within like the social justice sphere. And somebody, and I can't remember, and I'm not going to name names, directly said, like, we're not going to include disabled people in our paper because there's a whole other field to do that for us, which I think talks to the problematic nature of adapted PE and PE being separated. We really aren't different. We're essentially the same field. We just care about different people. So, Mara, I just talked over and around all of the questions you asked without without talking about the intersectionality stuff because I figured Wes could take that instead ranted on everything else.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, I think I will say that I'm on a still like this personal professional journey trying to figure my own like kind of place, my own reflexivity and how what I do, who I am, kind of affects my perspectives on things. I will say though, I think in the last couple of years I've been a lot more introspective through conversations that I've had with other scholars and through conversations I've had with disabled folk who are around me, and trying to be okay with not being seen as like this perfect like inclusion you know like just the infallible type of scholar type of thing. And so recently some of the doc students that I'm working with, they're doing some things that are pretty directly critical of some of the earlier things that I've written. And so I think that was sort of a poignant moment for me, like, well, this is the kind of stuff that needs to happen to, not only move you individually in the field, but then also being okay with that kind of what am I trying to say? Okay with that type of uh, course correction. But I do think that one of the things that I see hopefully evolving in my work is this idea of co-construction. That's an idea that I'm still learning about, how to do it well, how to do it, even how to do it badly. That I think that I want to explore how that looks like meaningfully, right? Because I think there is a role and expectation that faculty as being the gatekeepers of knowledge generation, that if that knowledge isn't co-created, then that's really problematic, and that's what leads to things like checklist, where things like lining up for PE class is considered a property of an inclusive class. Does that make sense? I feel like I talked uh, around the question too.
I mean, to be fair, it was a complex and hard question, but I think you gave a great answer to it. I mean, and like I said, so much of what you're saying mirrors any of the work with whatever social justice sphere we choose to devote our, you know, professional lives to. So it is very useful to hear from both of you about what we need to be thinking about, whether it's working with disabled students or disabled, individuals, or students of color and faculty of color, or, any marginalized identity like this. There is a lot of overlap there while also recognizing the specificity of adapted PE and the need, the really direct, very well documented need for PE in specific to grapple with how we construct the adapted PE in disabled students. So I think you did great. Is there anyone on the call who has any other questions or would like to add to the discussion before I send you all off?
Mara, I will say, there's a few familiar names on here with, Sean, and I remember Martin. I think he was down at New Mexico. But to see all these other names, like, it's a nice opportunity to be able to share some of the work that we do with people who we're, less familiar with. So, it's a pleasure to be able to share this stuff. And I know Wes is open to it. I'm more than happy to talk, probably obvious at this stage, but extensively about this work. I'm going to talk a little bit about this at NACAHE coming up too, at one of those lectures I'm going to do.
Awesome. I mean, one of the goals of including you, besides having renowned APE researchers speak to us, was to try and start the idea of connecting in our AERA SIG, right? That we want adapted scholars who do work on adapted PE. Like, you have a place at the AERA SIG, you are PE, and we want you there, and we want to learn and grow, because even if that's not our area of research, that doesn't mean that we don't want to create some inclusion, whatever, however we define that, like we want you there. And so if people on the call fall within the adapted sphere, and you don't had not necessarily thought about the SIG as a place for you, I would really challenge that and welcome to have more conversation and more dialogue around what the SIG93 brings to our field in terms of research, and how we can support researchers who focus on adapted PE, and disability inclusion. That was one main goal of mine in the creation of this webinar. So to that end, huge round of applause to Wes and Justin. Thank you so much for doing this. I know at this time in the semester it's an ask, and I'm very, very, very grateful. And I loved the presentation. I learned things, and am going to be thinking about it for a while going forward, which is why I knew I would be when I invited you on. So I'm going to stop the recording, and thank you to those of you who are here.